The Red Ribbon, a story of hope.
Not long ago, in a nearby land, a good king looked out over his kingdom. From high in the castle tower, he could see everything. Tall trees in the forests, beautiful gardens and farmlands, the crystal blue river, and all of the people who lived and worked in the village below. One would think, with all these beautiful things in sight, the king would be very happy, but he wasn't. Instead, the king was quite sad. All he could see when he looked out his window was the terrible sadness in his kingdom. Because the people in the village were afraid, the king worried, and the smile he once had turned into a big frown. The king knew if he didn't do something soon to stop the sadness, he and his kingdom might never be happy again. So the king sent royal messengers to find the wisest, most powerful people in all the land and invite them to the castle to help save the kingdom. He invited dukes and duchesses, princes and princesses, lords and scholars. When they arrived, he gathered them all in a big room to tell them about the terrible sadness he could see from his window.
"My friends,"
he said,
"the kingdom has great forests with many trees for wood. Yet I see people who have no houses. The crystal river is full of fish, and there are farms as far as the eye can see. Yet I see many people who are hungry because they have no food. There are people from many nations with much to share, yet I see selfishness and fear. And the saddest thing of all,"
the king said as his frown grew even bigger,
"though I listen as hard as I can, I hear no children laughing. I can see no children playing. They stay in their homes afraid to come outside. My friends, I need your help. You are my last hope. If we don't stop the sadness, it will soon destroy the kingdom."
The sounds of whispering filled the room as the guests tried hard to think of ways to help the king.
Your Majesty,
Someone cried.
perhaps you could send a brave knight to conquer the terrible sadness. Yes,
Agreed everyone.
surely a brave knight could save the kingdom.
The king, sitting on his throne, just shook his head.
"I have already tried that. I sent the mightiest knight in all the land to conquer the sadness, but it was too strong. My brave knight was defeated."
I've got it!
Exclaimed another guest.
Perhaps the kingdom is under an evil spell and a great wizard is needed to stop the sadness.
Again, everyone agreed.
Yes. Surely a wizard could save the kingdom.
Again, the king shook his head.
"I'm sorry, my friends, but you see, I've tried that too. The sadness is not an evil spell. The wizard cannot help me."
The king could see that even his wise and powerful friends had no ideas, and the frown on his face was now bigger than ever. Suddenly, from the back of the room, they heard a voice.
Your Majesty, I know how to conquer the sadness.
Everyone grew very quiet, and all eyes looked to the back of the room as the man stepped forward from the shadows. They all stared as he made his way to the front. He seemed a plain, ordinary man dressed in plain, ordinary clothes. Over his shoulder he carried a curious leather sack. It was brown and exceedingly large. When the man reached the throne, he politely knelt before the king, who asked,
"Do I know you, sir? Are you a prince, or a duke, or a brave knight?"
Before the man could answer, a guest shouted.
He's a magician, look! He's carrying a bag of tricks.
The king inquired.
"Is that true? Are you a magician? Do you have magic that can heal my kingdom?"
The man smiled at the king.
Your Majesty, I am not a duke or a knight or a prince, and I am certainly not a magician. I'm just a simple weaver. I make clothes in the village below."
"A weaver?"
Marveled the king. Everyone started whispering again. The king squinted as he studied the stranger.
"How can you help me?"
The king asked. The man stood and explained.
Though I am not a king or a prince or a magician, I know of a great power that can stop the sadness. Gather everyone in the kingdom and meet me at the castle gates as the sun rises. Do exactly as I say, and the kingdom will be saved."
A guest cried.
This man is just a weaver from the village. What power could he have that we don't know about? After all, we are the wisest, most powerful people in the land.
There! Another guest quickly pointed out to the weaver's sack.
The magic power must be in that big brown sack.
The room quieted once again. The king leaned forward, peered at the sack, and asked the weaver,
Is the power to defeat the sadness in the leather sack you carry?
The weaver thought for a moment and then slowly leaned toward the king until their noses nearly touched.
As I said before, your majesty, gather everyone in the kingdom and meet me at sunset, and you shall see.
The king sat back in his throne and scratched his head.
This I have not tried,
He thought.
The weaver's magic may be my only hope.
And then he rose to his feet and commanded,
Send the royal messengers. We will meet at sunrise and do as the weaver says.
Wasting no time, the messengers rode throughout the land telling everyone about the weaver and his plan to save the kingdom.
The next morning, the king woke early and hurried down from the tower. Then he arrived at the gates. He could see that a large crowd had gathered and everyone was excited about the weaver and his magic. Moments later, the weaver appeared carrying his big brown sack. The crowd stepped aside as he made his way to the gates where the king waited.
The king, feeling the need to say something official, cleared his throat and spoke.
Loyal subjects, I give you the weaver.
Before he could say more, everyone started cheering. The king raised one hand to silence the crowd, and with the other he pointed to the big brown sack and asked,
Does this sack contain the magic that will stop the sadness and save my kingdom?
Before the weaver could answer, the crowd cheered yet again. Then the king stepped back and commanded,
Let it begin.
By now, the children had wiggled their way to the front of the crowd and formed a circle around the weaver and his leather sack. With eyes wide, not making a sound, they watched the weaver kneel down and open his sack. When he reached inside and gently pulled out a bright ribbon, it was the most beautiful ribbon anyone had ever seen, and it looked as if it could stretch for miles and miles and miles. The weaver then stood and held the ribbon high above his head.
In order for this magic to work,
He said,
you must do exactly as I say. This ribbon must be taken throughout the village, down the streets, through the alleys, and across the fields. You must take it throughout the kingdom, from the giant mountains to the great blue sea. Remember this, the ribbon must never touch the ground. Now listen very closely, for this is the most important part. Everyone in the kingdom must share in this task. If anyone is left out, the magic will be broken and the sadness will return.
When the weaver took the end of the red ribbon and carefully placed it in his hands of a small boy standing at the front of the crowd, he told the boy to take the ribbon and lead the way throughout the.
After the boy had taken a few steps into the crowd, the weaver shouted, Stop! The crowd gasped as the boy froze. Looking back over his shoulder, the boy could see that if he took one more step, the long ribbon would touch the ground. The crowd was silent.
The weaver said nothing. The king was speechless. Then the tiny girl stepped out of the front of the crowd and, reaching out her little hands, lifted the sagging red ribbon high above her head. Without a word, she and the young boy turned and carried the ribbon forward.
Now everyone understood. One by one, the people of the kingdom stepped forward to take their share of the ribbon. The banker followed the carpenter, who followed the school teacher, who followed the blacksmith. On and on they came to carry the bright red ribbon throughout the kingdom. Before long, hundreds of people were holding the ribbon, and it stretched from one corner of the kingdom to the other. They
held it up above their heads, just like the little girl, so that it would never touch the ground. The king looked at the people, at the ribbon stretching far into the distance. He looked at the leather sack and then at the weaver.
So,
He said,
when does the magic begin?
It has already begun.
The weaver replied, and with that he kindly took the king by his arm and led him along the great red ribbon.